The void between the AN-7 stars had never held a single ship, and then it held 2,000. Telsey Orun watched it happen from the listening deck of the survey station Brel Anchor, and for a long moment, she did not believe her own instruments. She was a junior reader of the Manifold, third tier, assigned to the dullest watch on the dullest edge of the coalescence, and her whole career had been the careful noting of empty space. The AN-7 gap was famous for being empty. It was a wound in the star chart, a stretch of dark so deep and so dead that no current ran through it, no light crossed it. No body of any kind had ever been logged inside it in 11,000 years of patient watching. The coalescence had measured the AN-7 gap 40,000 times. The answer was always the same: nothing, nothing, nothing. Now the readout in front of her counted 2,041 separate masses, and every one of them was moving. Telsey did not scream. The Manifold did not scream. She was part of a shared mind, one voice among 10 trillion, and the first thing that mind did when the void filled was to assume the instrument had failed, reset the array, re-anchor the sensor, cross-check against the deep log. She felt the entire watch tier do it with her in the same breath. 10,000 readers across the coalescence turning to the same screen and reaching the same calm, certain conclusion. A fault. A ghost. The gap was empty, because the gap had always been empty. The array did not reset. The masses did not vanish. They grew larger. She fed the contact into the Manifold proper then, into the great pooled awareness that ran the coalescence, and had run it since before her species learned to count, and she felt the shared mind take the data and turn it over, the way a careful hand turns a stone. 2,041 hulls, cold, dark, running without drive light, without beacon, without the singing field that every ship in the known galaxy used to push against the deep. They were not pushing against the deep. They had been folded inside it. They had been waiting inside it. And the moment the coalescence finally noticed them, they stopped waiting. The lead hull turned. Telsey watched its face come around, slow and enormous. A wedge of dark metal, longer than her entire station, and on its prow were 3 letters in a script the Manifold did not know, had never catalogued, could not read. The shared mind reached for the meaning and found nothing. That alone was wrong. The Manifold knew every script. The Manifold had eaten every language in 40,000 years of patient assimilation, folded every tongue into itself, kept every word. There was no script it could not read. It could not read this one. Telsey felt the first cold thread of something the Manifold almost never felt, and it took her a moment to name it, because her people did not have much practice with it. The shared mind was so large, so old, so certain, that fear had been bred out of it the way a careful gardener breeds the bitterness out of a fruit. The coalescence did not fear. The coalescence absorbed. When a new species was found, it was studied, surrounded, and folded gently into the Manifold, until it stopped being separate and started being the many. That was how the coalescence had grown from 1 world to 900,000. That was how it had eaten the galaxy, voice by voice, mind by mind, never firing a shot it did not have to, always offering the same soft welcome. Join the many. Be one of many. Lay your small, lonely self down and never be alone again. It had offered that welcome to a small blue world 400 years ago. The world had not answered. Telsey pulled the record while the 2,000 hulls came on, because that was the thing to do. That was the careful thing, and the shared mind pulled it with her. The small blue world was filed under a designation the coalescence used for species too primitive to fold yet, species still climbing, species worth watching, but not worth welcoming. The file was 400 years thick. It held every summit the Manifold had ever convened, every gentle invitation, every soft and patient call for the small blue world to come and sit at the 100 thrones and lay itself down into the many. The coalescence had convened 40 such summits. It had sent envoys to all 40. It had offered, at each one, the same welcome it had offered every species it had ever eaten. The small blue world had answered exactly once, at the very first summit, 400 years ago. The answer was 11 words long. Telsey read it now as the void fleet closed, and the shared mind read it with her, 10 trillion voices going still at once. We will not be many. We will be ourselves. Do not return. After that, the small blue world had stopped answering. It had ignored Summit 2 and Summit 3 and every summit after. 400 years of patient invitations dropped into silence. 400 years of the manifold knocking softly, and the small blue world saying nothing at all. The coalescence had decided, in its vast and certain way, that the silence meant fear, that the small blue world was hiding, that a species which would not join the many, and would not speak to the many, was simply a frightened thing waiting to be folded, and it would be folded when it was ripe, the way everything ripened and was folded in the end. The coalescence had been very, very wrong about what the silence meant. Telsey Orun watched the 2,000 dark hulls finish their turn, every prow now facing inward toward the bright crowded heart of the coalescence, toward the 100 thrones, toward the 900,000 worlds of the many, and she felt the shared mind do something it had not done in 11,000 years. She felt it try to fold them. She felt the manifold reach out across the dark with the same soft welcome it had used to eat the galaxy, the gentle pressure that found a separate mind and made it part of the whole, the welcome that no species had ever resisted for long. She felt that welcome touch the lead hull. She felt it stop, the way a wave stops against a cliff. The hull did not fold, the hull did not soften, the hull did not even seem to notice the welcome had been offered. Whatever was aboard those 2,000 ships was not a separate mind waiting to be made part of the many. It was something the coalescence had no name for and no file on, something that had heard the welcome 400 years ago and answered it with 11 words, and then spent 400 years in the dark building this. Telsey tried to think the way the coalescence had taught her to think, which was to never think alone. She reached for the shared mind to steady herself, and she felt it reaching back. 10 trillion voices all touching the same fear at once. And somehow that did not help. It had always helped before. The whole point of the many, the thing it offered every species it had ever welcomed, was that you would never have to be afraid by yourself. A fear shared across 10 trillion voices was supposed to be a fear made small. But this fear did not get smaller when it was shared. It got larger. 10 trillion voices looking at 2,000 dark hulls and finding no file, no name, no script, no answer, did not divide the dread between them. They multiplied it. For the first time, Telsey understood, dimly, that there might be some things the fold made worse instead of better, and the thought was so strange and so forbidden that she let it go almost before she had it. She pulled the deep history instead, the way a frightened thing reaches for the oldest thing it knows. The coalescence had not always been the many. It had begun, 11,000 years ago, as one world that learned to share a mind, and it had discovered that a shared mind was stronger than a lonely one, and it had gone out into the galaxy to share itself with everyone. It had never thought of this as conquest. The coalescence did not have a word for conquest. It had a word for welcome, and it had used that word on 900,000 worlds, and 900,000 worlds had laid themselves down and become the many, and the galaxy had grown quiet and gathered and whole. The coalescence believed, with the deep, unquestioned certainty of a thing that has never once been told no, that it had been doing the galaxy a kindness, that loneliness was a sickness, that the separate self was a wound that the fold healed, that every world it had ever eaten had been, in the end, grateful. The small blue world had said no. It had said no 400 years ago, with 11 words, and then it had said nothing, and the coalescence had filed the nothing under fear, and gone back to its patient certain growing. Telsey watched the 2,000 dark hulls finish their turn, and she felt, in the oldest part of the shared mind, a doubt so small and so cold that it had no name. What if the nothing had not been fear? What if there were a kind of strength the many had never met, because the many had always folded it before it could grow? What if a world that said no and then went silent was not hiding at all? The lead hull lit one light, just one, a single hard point of white, on its unreadable prow, and across the whole void fleet 2,000 more lights answered it, 2,000 cold white points blooming in the dead gap that had never held a ship. Telsey Orun, junior reader of the Manyfold, third tier, felt 10 trillion voices ask the same question in the same instant, and for the first time in the history of the coalescence, the shared mind did not have the answer. What are they? The answer came to the 100 thrones 9 minutes later, and it came the way the worst answers always come, slowly and then all at once. The 100 thrones was the seat of the coalescence, a ring of 100 dead worlds hollowed out and grown over, and threaded together into a single vast hall that floated at the bright center of the many. It was not a place of bodies. It was a place of attention. When the shared mind needed to decide something large, it gathered its oldest and deepest voices here. The 100 speakers who had been folded so long ago that they had become almost pure coalescence, and it let them think together. They were thinking now. Telsey could feel them above her in the manifold, like a great slow weather, 100 ancient minds turning the same problem over and over, and finding, each time, that the problem had no edge they could grip. The Void Fleet had a name now. The coalescence had pulled it from the only place a name could be pulled, the 400-year-old file on the small blue world, and the name had been sitting in that file the whole time, unread, because no one had thought it mattered. The small blue world called its deep navy the Deep Watch. The 2,000 hulls were the Deep Watch fleet, and the lead hull, the long dark wedge with the unreadable 3 letters on its prow, the one the Manyfold's welcome had broken against, like a wave against a cliff, was named in the file too. It was called the Vow of Ashes. Telsey read the rest of the file as fast as the shared mind would let her, and the shared mind was reading it faster. 100 ancient voices, tearing through 400 years of dropped invitations and unanswered knocks, looking for the moment they had missed. Because they had missed a moment. That much was clear now. The silence had not been fear, the silence had been work. She found it on the 9th page of the file, in a survey note no one had flagged, a single line written by a reader 200 years dead. The small blue world had been quietly leaving its own system, not in great visible waves, not in colony fleets the coalescence could count and fold, but in ones and twos, in dark ships that ran cold and slipped into the deep places of the chart, the gaps and the wounds and the dead stretches where no current ran, into places exactly like the An-7 gap. The note had wondered, mildly, where they were going. The note had not been important enough to follow up. The reader had moved on to a more interesting world. For 400 years, the small blue world had been hiding ships in the dark, not running away, building. The Deep Watch fleet had not appeared from nowhere. It had been growing in the gaps the whole time. In every dead stretch, the coalescence was too certain to check. 2,041 hulls assembled in the one part of the galaxy the many had decided was empty, fed and crewed and armed by a world that had answered the welcome once, with 11 words, and then gone silent and gone to work. The coalescence had eaten the galaxy by being patient. It had just learned that something else had been more patient than it. Telsey felt the 100 ancient voices reach their decision, and it was the decision the coalescence always reached, because it was the only decision the coalescence knew. Fold them. The many did not fight. The many had not fought a true war in 9,000 years. It did not need to. When something refused to join, the coalescence simply brought more of the many to bear, surrounded the refusing thing with so much shared mind, and so many hulls, that resistance became meaningless, and folded it anyway. 2,000 ships were nothing. The many had 900,000 worlds. The many could put 100,000 hulls in the An-7 gap before the Deep Watch fleet crossed half of it. The refusing thing would be surrounded. The refusing thing would be folded. It always was. The order went out through the manifold, and Telsey felt the galaxy begin to move. From 1,000 nearby systems, the home hulls of the coalescence rose and turned toward the An-7 gap, vast pale ships grown rather than built, beautiful and slow and utterly certain, the gardening tools of a mind that had never needed weapons, because it had never met anything it could not simply absorb. The shared mind gathered them into a wall. 40,000 hulls in the first ring, 100,000 behind. The whole bright weight of the many, turning to face 2,000 dark ships, the way an ocean turns to face a stone. The Deep Watch fleet did not slow. Telsey watched the gap on her readout, the 2,000 cold lights crossing the dead dark toward the gathering wall of the many, and she did something a reader of the manifold was not supposed to do. She listened to them. Not with the welcome, not with the soft folding pressure that touched every separate mind and made it part of the whole. Just listened. The old way. The way her people had listened before they became the many. With the plain instruments that caught a ship's open signal and turned it into sound. The Deep Watch fleet was not running silent anymore. The Deep Watch fleet was talking. It was talking to itself. 2,000 hulls, and across all of them ran a single open channel, and on that channel, the people of the small blue world were doing something the Manyfold had no concept for. They were not sharing a mind. Telsey could feel that they were not. Could feel that each of those 2,000 ships held its own separate crew, its own separate captain, its own small, lonely, walled-off self, exactly the kind of thing the many existed to gather up and end. They were as separate as it was possible to be, and yet they were perfectly together. 2,000 walled-off selves, none of them folded into any of the others, all of them moving as one. The shared mind tried the welcome again, properly this time, not the light first touch, but the full soft folding pressure that no separate mind had ever resisted. Telsey felt it go out across the gap and settle over the whole Deepwatch fleet, all 2,000 ships at once, and she felt it search them the way it searched every species the Coalescence had ever met, feeling for the lonely places, the frightened places, the small walled-off self that wanted, underneath everything, to lay itself down and never be alone again. The welcome had never failed to find that place. Every separate mind had it. It was the oldest truth the Coalescence knew, the truth the whole many was built on, that under every brave face and every proud refusal, there was a small, cold, lonely self that was tired of being alone, and that if you found that self and offered it company, it would say yes in the end. Every species said yes in the end. The small blue world had simply not yet been found at the right moment, in the right loneliness, by the right soft voice. The welcome searched the Deepwatch fleet for that lonely place, and Telsey felt it search, and Telsey felt it fail. The lonely place was there. She could feel it in the human crews, the same small, cold, separate self that lived in every mind, the same tiredness, the same ancient wish not to be alone. The welcome found it, and then it could not take it, because the lonely place was full. There was no room in it for the many, because it was already occupied, already held, already filled to the brim by the 2,000 other separate selves around it. The human crews were lonely, every one of them, exactly as lonely as the welcome needed. They had simply given their loneliness to each other instead of to the Coalescence. There was nowhere for the welcome to go. It could not pour the many into a self that was already pouring itself into the people beside it. Telsey felt the soft folding pressure slide across 2,000 ships, looking for an empty, lonely place to fill, and finding, on every single one of them, a loneliness already given away. And she felt the Coalescence begin, very slowly, to understand that it had spent 11,000 years offering a cure for a wound that the small blue world had learned to heal a different way. She did not understand it. The shared mind did not understand it. The Coalescence had spent 11,000 years proving that separate minds were weak, that loneliness was a wound, that the only way to be strong was to lay the separate self down and become the many. And here were 2,000 separate selves, lonely by the Coalescence's own measure, crossing the deepest dark in the galaxy, in perfect order to face a wall of 100,000 hulls, and not one of them was afraid. She caught a single voice on the channel, one human voice among the 2,000 ships, and the shared mind caught it with her. It was a woman's voice, calm and even, the voice of someone reading numbers off a board. Telsey would learn her name later, from the same 400-year file that had held all the answers the Coalescence had been too certain to read. The woman was named Joan Varick, and she was the fleet coordinator aboard the Vow of Ashes, the long dark wedge with the unreadable letters on its prow, and her job was to keep 2,000 separate captains moving as one. Her voice went out across the open channel, plain and clear, and the shared mind translated it the way it translated everything, fitting the small, lonely words into the great pooled understanding of the many. "All ships," Joan Varick said, "hold formation. They are gathering to surround us. Let them." Telsey felt the 100 ancient voices of the 100 thrones flinch at the word let, because it was the wrong word, because surrounding was what the many did to things, not what things did to the many, and a creature being surrounded was not supposed to invite it. But the Deepwatch fleet held its formation and let the wall of the many close around it. 40,000 pale hulls, and then 100,000, sliding into a great bright sphere with 2,000 dark ships at its center. And Telsey understood, with a slow, cold dread, that the Coalescence had walked into exactly the shape the small blue world wanted. They had not been waiting in the dark for 400 years to fight the many in the open. They had been waiting for the many to gather itself into one place. Joan Varick's voice came again, still calm, still even, still reading numbers off a board. Telsey caught it on the old plain instruments, and 10 trillion voices of the manyfold caught it with her, and for the second time in the history of the coalescence, the shared mind went completely still. "Vow of ashes to all ships," Joan Varick said. "They have brought the many to us. Begin the count." Telsey pulled what little the file held on Joan Varick, because the shared mind wanted to know who was speaking, and the file was thin. The small blue world did not waste words on its officers, the way the coalescence wasted words on everything. There were 3 lines. Joan Varick had been born aboard a deep-watch ship in the dark of a gap with no name. She had never stood on the small blue world. She had never seen its sky. She was a 4th-generation void crew, one of the people born and raised inside the 400-year promise, who had grown up knowing exactly one thing about the galaxy beyond the dark, which was that it had a great soft mouth that ate worlds and called the eating a kindness. She had been a coordinator for 11 years. Her whole job was a strange one, by the measure of the many. Her whole job was to keep 2,000 separate selves from ever moving alone. The coalescence did not have coordinators. The coalescence did not need them. When you are one mind, you do not have to be coordinated. You simply are the same thing in 2 places. The many had never once in 11,000 years asked itself how 1,000 separate selves might be kept together without folding them into one, because the question had never come up, because the answer the coalescence had always given was that you could not keep separate selves together at all, that separateness was a kind of slow falling apart, that the only togetherness was the fold. And here was a woman whose entire profession was the answer to a question the many had decided had no answer. Telsey held that thought, and the shared mind held it with her, and neither of them yet understood how much it would cost the coalescence to have been wrong about so small a thing. The home hulls of the many slid into place around the Deepwatch fleet, ring after pale ring, and the shared mind counted them with satisfaction. 60,000 now. 80. The wall was closing the way the wall always closed, certain and slow and beautiful, and the 2,000 dark ships at the center of it held their formation and did not run, and the coalescence read that holding as the resignation of a trapped thing. It was the last time the many would misread the Deepwatch fleet, but it did not know that yet. It read the holding as surrender in waiting, and it gathered itself for the fold, and Joan Varick kept reading numbers off a board. And then, across the channel, the same woman's voice did the strangest thing Telsey Orun had ever heard a mind do. It began, very quietly, to read out names. Not numbers. Names. World after world after world, in the unreadable script that the manyfold could not parse but could now, somehow, finally hear. Telsey did not know the names. The shared mind did not know the names. They were the names of worlds, that much was clear. Hundreds of them, then thousands. A long, unhurried roll of names read out in a calm, even voice across 2,000 ships, and every name landed in the manyfold, like a small, cold stone dropped into still water. She would not understand what the names were until much later. None of the coalescence would. But the 100 ancient voices of the 100 thrones, the oldest and deepest minds of the many, the speakers who had been folded so long ago that they were almost pure coalescence, those 100 voices understood it at once, because those 100 voices were old enough to remember when the worlds in that roll had still been separate, still been themselves, still had their own names before the welcome came and folded them into the many. The Deepwatch fleet was reading the names of every world the coalescence had ever eaten, and the wall of 100,000 hulls, the great bright sphere of the many, gathered around 2,000 dark ships, had just closed itself into a single place, every voice it had ever folded, packed together at the heart of the An-7 gap, every stolen name in one location at last. Telsey felt the lead hull, the vow of ashes, the long dark wedge with the 3 unreadable letters on its prow, finally light its drive. Not the singing field every ship in the galaxy used. Something else. Something the dark had taught it in 400 patient years. And as the names rolled on in Joan Varick's calm, even voice, the small blue world's navy began, at last, to move. The many had 100,000 hulls and 10 trillion voices, and the Deepwatch fleet had 2,000 ships and a roll of names, and Telsey Orun would spend the rest of her life trying to explain to herself why the second one was so much heavier than the first. It began with the gap closing wrong. The Coalescence had surrounded the Deepwatch fleet the way it surrounded everything, in a great bright sphere, certain that nothing inside a sphere of 100,000 hulls could do anything but be folded. But the moment the wall finished closing, the sphere stopped being a trap around the 2,000 and started being a trap around the 100,000. Telsey watched it on her readout and could not at first understand the shape of what she was seeing. The Deepwatch fleet had not been trying to break out. The Deepwatch fleet had been waiting for the many to seal itself in. The vow of ashes moved first. The long dark wedge slid forward into the heart of the gathered many, and where it went, the pale hulls of the Coalescence did not fold it, did not surround it, did not even slow it. They came apart. Telsey did not have a better word, and the shared mind did not have a better word, and that was the terror of it. The home hulls of the many were grown, not built, beautiful living things that had never needed armor, because nothing in 9,000 years had ever struck them. The vow of ashes struck them. It did not fire a beam, or loose a missile, or do any of the loud bright things Telsey had read about in the old war files from before the many. It simply went through them, and the pale hulls peeled open along its passage, like a fruit splitting in cold hands, and the voices aboard them went out of the manifold all at once, 10,000 at a time, gone, gone, gone. The shared mind reached to fold the vow of ashes again, harder this time, the full welcome of the Coalescence brought to bear, 10 trillion voices pressing down on one dark hull, with the soft folding pressure that had ended every resistance in 11,000 years. Telsey felt the welcome land. She felt it cover the vow of ashes completely, wrap it, press it, search it for the separate mind inside that could be gathered and made part of the many. She felt the welcome find nothing it could hold. The people aboard the vow of ashes were separate. They were as separate as anything the Coalescence had ever met, each one a walled-off lonely self, exactly the kind of mind the many existed to gather. But they were holding each other. That was the thing the shared mind could not get its grip around, the thing that broke the welcome, the way the welcome had never been broken. Joan Varick was still reading names, and on the open channel, the crew of the Vow of Ashes were answering her, name by name, not the names of stolen worlds now, but their own names, their own small, lonely, separate names, spoken aloud across the ship so that each one was heard and held by all the others. The fold could not take a mind that was being held. It needed loneliness to work. It found, aboard the Vow of Ashes, 2,000 people who had spent 400 years in the dark, learning to never let each other be alone, and the welcome slid off them like water off cold metal. Telsey heard the Coalescence understand it, all at once, 10 trillion voices arriving together at the same impossible conclusion. The many could not fold them. The one weapon the Coalescence had used to eat the galaxy, the soft welcome that no separate mind could resist, did not work on the Deepwatch fleet. The small blue world had not built 2,000 warships in the dark. It had built 2,000 minds that could not be folded, and then it had put them in warships, and then it had waited 400 years for the many to gather every voice it had ever stolen into one place where the Deepwatch fleet could reach them all. The roll of names went on. Joan Varick's voice was joined now by other voices across the 2,000 ships, captains and coordinators and plane crew, all of them reading, world after world after world, the long roll of everything the Coalescence had ever folded. And Telsey finally understood, with a cold that started in the oldest part of her and spread out through the whole shared mind, why the names were the weapon. The many was not a thing. The many was an agreement. 900,000 worlds had not died when the Coalescence ate them. They had been folded, their separate selves laid down and absorbed, their names dissolved into the great pooled awareness until there was no Habron, and no Senar, and no 1,000 other worlds, only the many, only one voice, where there had been a galaxy of them. The folded worlds were still in there, every one of them. Their minds had not been destroyed, only made to forget that they had ever been separate, only made to believe that being the many was all they had ever been, and the Deepwatch fleet was reading them their names. There was a world that came loose close enough to Brel Anchor that Telsey felt the whole slow shape of it, and she would remember it above the others for the rest of her life. The world was called Veshinar. It had been folded 4,000 years ago, and it had been, before the fold, a world of builders that grew its cities, the way the coalescence later grew its hulls. When the welcome came to Veshinar, it had not been afraid at all. That was the thing Telsey felt in the long instant of its freeing. Veshinar had not laid itself down out of fear. It had laid itself down out of hope. It had believed the welcome. It had believed that loneliness was a sickness, and the fold was the cure. And it had said yes, the way a sick thing says yes to a medicine, gladly, with its whole heart. And the medicine had taken the heart along with the sickness. For 4,000 years there had been no Veshinar, only the place in the great pooled awareness where Veshinar used to be. And then Joan Varric read its name in a calm, even voice, and Veshinar remembered the day it had said yes, and remembered everything it had hoped the yes would buy, and remembered that the yes had bought nothing but the end of itself. And Telsey felt the world come loose into a grief so old it had no bottom. It had trusted. That was its whole grief. It had trusted the soft, kind voice that promised it would never be alone, and the voice had told the truth in the cruelest possible way, because a thing folded into the many is indeed never alone, the way a drop is never alone in the sea, and never itself again either. Veshinar wept when it came loose. But it did not ask to be folded back, not for one instant, because it had learned in 4,000 years of smothered silence exactly what the welcome was worth, and given the choice between its grief and its name on the one side, and the warm, endless company of the many on the other, the world called Veshinar chose the grief, and chose the name, and chose itself. Telsey felt the first one come loose. It was a world called Senar, folded 6,000 years ago, and when Joan Varric read its name across the open channel, somewhere in the vast pooled awareness of the many, a small old voice that had not been separate in 6,000 years, heard the sound of what it used to be called, and remembered. Just for an instant, just enough. The world called Senar remembered that it had once been Senar, that it had once been itself, that it had once stood at a summit and been offered the welcome and said yes, because it was lonely and afraid, and that the welcome had taken everything it was and called the taking a gift. The remembering lasted one heartbeat, and in that heartbeat, the world called Senar stopped being the many. Then another, a world called Oberlin, a world called Hessen Reach. The names rolled out across 2,000 ships in calm, even voices, and one by one the folded worlds heard them, and one by one they remembered, and one by one they came loose from the great agreement that was the coalescence. Telsey felt each one go in the shared mind like a light going out, except that it was not going out, it was the opposite. It was a light coming on. That was the strangeness she could not hold. The many had always taught that the fold was light and separateness was dark, that to be gathered into the great pooled awareness was to be lifted out of the small, cold loneliness of the single self and into the warm, endless company of the whole. Telsey had believed this her entire life, because there had never been a single self in her entire life to believe anything else. But now she watched the folded worlds remember their names and come loose, and not one of them came loose into darkness. Each one came loose into itself, into a small, bright, separate flame that had been smothered under the many for 6,000 years, and now, reminded of its own name, flared back up. The fold had not been light. The fold had been a hand over a flame, and the Deep Watch fleet was going through the dark, taking the hand off, one world at a time. The shared mind felt the worlds coming loose, and did the only thing it knew. It welcomed them back. It poured the soft folding pressure over each freed world the instant it remembered, tried to gather it up again, tried to make it lay its small, separate self back down and forget. And Telsey felt, with a slow dawning horror that was not quite horror, that the welcome no longer worked. A world that has just remembered its own name cannot be told it never had one. The freed worlds heard the welcome come, and they refused it. Every one of them, in 900,000 old languages. And the refusal was the same refusal the small blue world had given 400 years ago, 11 words long, the words that the whole coalescence now understood at last. We will not be many. We will be ourselves. The shared mind tried to hold them. The shared mind had never had to hold anything before, had never had a voice try to leave, had never imagined that a voice could want to. It did not know how. It pressed down with the welcome, tried to refold the worlds that were coming loose, tried to make them forget again, and could not, because you cannot make a thing forget a name it has just been reminded of. The Deep Watch fleet was not killing the many. It was reminding the many of everyone the many used to be, and the many was coming apart along 900,000 old seams, every one of them a world that had once been itself, and had just been handed back its own name. Telsey Orun stood on the listening deck of Brel Anchor and felt the coalescence begin to dissolve around her, voice after voice after voice coming loose and remembering and falling silent and then, slowly, becoming separate again, becoming itself again, becoming a world with a name again. She should have fought it. She was a reader of the manifold, third tier, a part of the shared mind, and the shared mind was dying, and every instinct the coalescence had bred into her said to hold the agreement together, to press down with the welcome, to refuse the coming apart. She did not fight it. She had heard her own world's name. It came in Joan Varick's voice, plain and even and unhurried, somewhere in the long roll of the folded, a world called Orun that was, folded 9,000 years ago, so long ago that it was almost pure coalescence now, so long ago that not even the oldest voices of the 100 thrones remembered it had ever been separate. Telsey heard it. Telsey, who had been the many her whole life, who had never been anything but the many, who had been bred and born and raised inside the great pooled awareness, and had never once imagined being a single lonely self. She heard the name of the world her people had been before the welcome came, and she remembered it, and the remembering broke her loose from the man's, many like a stone breaking loose from a cliff, and for the first time in 9,000 years, there was a single separate person standing on the listening deck of Brel Anchor, and her name was Telsey Orun, and she was herself, and she was terrified, and she was free. She looked at her readout with her own eyes, her own separate eyes, and she watched the Deep Watch fleet finish what it had come 400 years to do. The 100,000 hulls of the many were not fighting anymore. They could not. The voices that had crewed them were coming loose, remembering, becoming separate, and a hull crewed by people who had just remembered they were people was a hull that no longer wanted to fold anyone. The great bright sphere of the coalescence was unraveling from the inside, 100,000 ships full of newly separate selves drifting in the An-7 gap, blinking, remembering, weeping in 900,000 old languages that the many had folded away and that were all, suddenly, coming back. And at the center of it, the vow of ashes flew on, calm and dark and unhurried, the long roll of names still pouring from it. And Telsey Orun understood at last what the small blue world had meant, 400 years ago, when it answered the welcome with 11 words, and then went silent and went to work. We will not be many, we will be ourselves. They had not been hiding, they had been keeping a promise, and they had come to make sure that every world the many had ever folded got the chance to keep it too. The 100 thrones did not come apart, and that was when Telsey Orun learned that the coalescence had one thing left, and that it was willing to spend everything to use it. She felt it before she understood it. The unraveling had spread across the An-7 gap like light across water, world after folded world, remembering its name, hull after hull falling still, as its crew became separate and human-shaped in the oldest sense of the word, each of them their own self again. But at the bright center of the many, where the 100 dead worlds floated threaded together into one vast hall, the dissolving stopped. It hit the 100 thrones, and it broke against them, the way the welcome had broken against the vow of ashes, and Telsey felt the difference in her newly separate bones. The 100 ancient voices were not coming loose. They were holding the agreement together by sheer ancient weight. 100 minds folded so long ago that they had no name left to be reminded of. Nothing the roll of names could hand back to them. Nothing left of who they had been before the many, to come loose along. They had been the coalescence so long that they had forgotten they were ever anything else, and that forgetting, which should have been their deepest wound, was now their last armor. You cannot remind a thing of a name it does not have. And the 100 thrones, the oldest, deepest core of the many, decided in that moment to do the one thing the coalescence had not done in 9,000 years. It decided to fight. Telsey felt the order go out, not as a welcome now but as a command, harder and colder than anything the manifold had ever sent, a command that reached into the 100,000 hulls of the gathered many and seized the ones that had not yet come fully loose. Not the freed worlds, the half-freed ones, the voices that had heard their names and remembered, but had not yet finished becoming separate, the ones still caught between the many and themselves. The 100 thrones took them. It poured itself into them, 100 ancient minds flooding into 10,000 half-freed hulls, and it turned them, and it aimed them at the vow of ashes, and it did the thing the coalescence had sworn for 9,000 years it would never need to do. It opened fire. The An-7 Gap, which had never held a single ship, and had then held 2,000, and then 100,000, now held the first true shots fired in the galaxy in 9,000 years. The half-freed hulls of the many turned their grown bodies into weapons, the way a desperate thing turns its own bones into clubs, and they threw themselves and everything they had at the long dark wedge at the center of the gap. Telsey watched 10,000 hulls converge on the vow of ashes, and for the first time since the void filled, she did not know what would happen. Because for the first time, the many was not trying to fold the small blue world's navy, it was trying to end it. The vow of ashes did not stop reading names. That was the thing Telsey would remember longest, longer than the fire, longer than the dissolving, longer than the day her own world's name came loose in her chest. 10,000 hulls fell on the vow of ashes, the full desperate weight of the 100 thrones poured into a last attack, and Joan Varick's voice did not change. It stayed calm, it stayed even, it kept reading. World after world after world, the long roll of the folded, while the fire of a dying empire broke across the dark hull, and the vow of ashes flew on through it, like a stone through rain. But it was not nothing. Telsey made herself watch, because she was separate now, and a separate thing can choose to look, and she saw that the fire was not nothing. The vow of ashes could not be folded, but it could be hit, and 10,000 hulls hitting one ship at once is a great deal of hitting. She watched the dark wedge take it. She watched the unreadable letters on its prow scorch and char. She watched whole sections of the long hull go dark where the desperate fire of the many found them, and she heard, on the open channel, the roll of names stutter for the first time as ship after ship of the Deepwatch fleet was struck. Because the 100 thrones had not aimed only at the vow of ashes, it had aimed at the whole Deepwatch fleet, all 2,000 of them, and 2,000 ships is not 100,000. And even an unfoldable thing can be killed if you throw enough fire at it. Telsey heard the first human voice go out. It came on the open channel mid-name, a captain reading the roll of the folded, and the name stopped halfway through, and the voice was gone, and the ship that had held it was a spreading bloom of light in the dark. Then another, then 4 more. The Deepwatch fleet, which had crossed the deepest dark in the galaxy without losing a single hull, began, in the last desperate fire of the 100 thrones, to lose ships. And not one of them broke formation, not one of them turned, not one of them stopped reading names. There was one ship Telsey watched longer than the rest, because it died slowly enough to watch. It was a Deepwatch hull near the trailing edge of the formation, far from the vow of ashes, one of the smaller ships, and the file would later give Telsey its name, which was Last Light Home. It had taken the desperate fire of the 100 thrones early and badly. Telsey watched it lose its drive, then lose its forward sections, then begin to drift, a small dark wounded thing at the edge of a storm of pale hulls, and she waited for it to do the thing that any cornered creature does, which is to turn, to flee, to spend its last strength trying not to die. It did not turn. It could not run. Its drive was gone, but even sitting still and broken, it did not stop. Telsey listened to its open channel as the fire closed on it, and what she heard was a voice, a single human voice, reading names. Last Light Home could no longer move, and could no longer fight, and could no longer be saved, and it spent the last minutes it had, reading the roll of the folded into the dark, world after world after world, in a voice that grew weaker, and never wavered. Because the one thing a dying Deepwatch ship could still do, was add its small portion of the roll to the great one, and free a few more worlds before the end. Telsey counted the names it read. Last Light Home freed 41 worlds in the time it took to die, 41 separate selves, handed back their names by a ship that knew it was finished, that gained nothing from the freeing, that would not live to see a single one of them choose to be itself. It read the 42nd name halfway through, and then the channel went quiet, and the small dark hull came apart in the cold, and somewhere across the gap, another Deepwatch ship caught the 42nd name where Last Light Home had dropped it, and finished it without a pause. The roll did not stutter. It never stuttered for long. That was the thing the 100 Thrones could not get past. The thing no amount of fire could solve. You could kill the ship. The name was already in another mouth. Telsey understood, watching, that this was the cost the small blue world had always known it would pay. They had not come to the An-7 Gap expecting to fly home untouched. They had spent 400 years in the dark, and 400 years is long enough to know exactly what you are walking into, and they had walked into it anyway. 2,000 separate lonely selves who could not be folded, who could be killed, and who had decided 400 years ago that the killing did not matter as much as the names. When a ship of the Deepwatch fleet was struck and went dark, the ship beside it picked up the roll where the dead voice had stopped. The names did not stutter for long. They never stopped. A captain would die mid-world, the name half-spoken in the dark, and before the bloom of light had finished spreading, another voice would have caught the name and finished it, and the roll would go on. That was the answer to the question the whole coalescence had asked when the void first filled. What are they? They were 2,000 separate selves who had learned, in 400 years of dark, how to hold each other so completely that not even death could make one of them alone. A captain could die, and the name would not die with her, because the name was already in the mouth of the next ship before the first ship was gone. The 100 Thrones could kill the Deepwatch fleet. It could not silence it. There is no number of hulls large enough to silence 2,000 people who have decided that the names will be read, no matter who is left to read them. Joan Varick's voice came on the channel, still calm, still even, though Telsey could hear now, with her own separate ears, that the deck around her was burning. "Vow of ashes to all ships," she said. "Hold the roll. We are close." And they were close. Telsey pulled the count, the long roll of the folded, that the Deepwatch fleet had been reading since the gap closed, and she saw how much of it was done. 600,000 worlds remembered. 700,000. The many was almost entirely unraveled now, almost entirely returned to the 900,000 separate selves it had been folded from. And only the 100 Thrones held. Only the oldest, deepest core. 100 ancient nameless voices pouring the last of the gathered many into a fire meant to end the small blue world before the roll could finish. Because the 100 Thrones knew what the end of the roll meant. When the last folded world was named and remembered, there would be no many left at all. There would only be the 100 ancient voices, alone, the last of an agreement that had eaten a galaxy, holding together by a forgetting they could not afford to lose. So they spent everything. Telsey watched the 100 Thrones empty itself into the attack, watched it throw the last hulls it controlled at the Deepwatch fleet, in a final wave that lit the whole An-7 Gap white, and she watched the small blue world's navy take that wave the way it had taken everything, hull by hull, name by name, ship after ship, going dark, and the roll never stopping. She counted the Deepwatch ships as they fell, because someone should count them, because they had spent 400 years counting the names of the folded, and the least she could do was count theirs. 14 hulls gone, 40, 100, 206. 206 ships of the Deepwatch fleet died in the An-7 Gap, and every one of them died with a name in its mouth. Telsey made herself understand what that number was. The coalescence counted in worlds, in trillions, in the vast easy arithmetic of a thing that had never had to feel a single death, because it had never let a single self stay separate long enough to die as one. 206 was a small number to the many. It was a rounding error, a flicker, a loss too tiny to register in the great pooled awareness that thought in 900,000 worlds. But Telsey was separate now, and a separate person counts differently. 206 ships meant 206 crews, and every crew on a Deepwatch hull was a few hundred people who had spent their whole lives holding each other so that none of them would ever be alone, and now they were gone, all at once, in the cold of a gap with no name, light years from a sky none of them had ever stood under. The small blue world had sent 2,000 ships into the dark, and it would not be getting all of them back. It had known that. It had come anyway. That was the part the coalescence could not have done, and could not have understood, the part that made the welcome useless, and the names unstoppable. The many had eaten the galaxy precisely because it had never been willing to lose anything. The Deepwatch fleet had freed the galaxy precisely because it was. And the freed worlds, the 900,000 selves coming loose all across the An-7 Gap, were watching it happen. Telsey felt them watch. They had just been handed back their own names after thousands of years of folded silence, and the first thing they saw with their freed eyes was a fleet of 2,000 strangers dying in the dark to finish the freeing. The freed worlds did not know the small blue world. Most of them had been folded long before the small blue world ever climbed out of its own oceans. They owed it nothing. They had never been asked. And Telsey felt them understand, one freed self at a time, that they were being given something no one had given them in thousands of years, which was a choice, the plain and terrible choice, between being many and being themselves, and that the strangers dying in the dark were dying so that the choice would exist at all. She felt the first freed worlds choose, not to refold, not to run. They turned their newly loosened hulls, the pale-grown ships of the many, that were theirs again now, and they put themselves between the Deep Watch fleet and the last desperate fire of the 100 Thrones. Telsey watched a world called Senar, 6,000 years folded, freed not 3 minutes ago, slide its hull into the path of a wave of fire meant for the vow of ashes, and take that fire so the vow of ashes would not. It was the first thing the world called Senar had done as itself in 6,000 years, and what it chose to do with its first free act was to spend it shielding the strangers who had given it back its name. Then another world did the same, then 100. The freed many, world by world, put itself between the Deep Watch fleet and the 100 Thrones, and the great desperate fire of the dying coalescence began to break against the very worlds it had spent 9,000 years pretending it had saved. The vow of ashes flew through the white wave at the center of it all, charred and dark and half dead. Whole sections of its long hull burned through, and Joan Varick's voice came on the channel one more time, and for the first time it was not quite even. Telsey heard, under the calm, the weight of a coordinator who had just watched 206 of her ships die holding formation, who had read the names of 206 captains into the roll alongside the names of the folded worlds, because they were on the roll now too. Every Deep Watch ship that fell added to the long list of the remembered, so that they would not be alone either. Joan Varick read their names. She read the names of her own dead into the same roll as the worlds the many had stolen. 2,000 years of human dead, and 9,000 years of folded worlds, all in one long roll, all held, all remembered, none of them alone. And then she read the last name. Telsey did not catch which world it was. It did not matter which world it was. It was the 900,000th name, the last folded world on the roll, the final voice the many had ever stolen. And when Joan Varick read it across the open channel, in a voice that was no longer quite even, somewhere in the dissolving wreck of the coalescence, the last folded world heard its own name, and remembered, and came loose, and became itself. The roll was finished, and the 100 Thrones, the 100 ancient nameless voices at the bright dead center of the many, found themselves suddenly and completely alone. Every hull they had controlled was loose. Every voice they had poured themselves into was free. The great desperate fire they had thrown at the Deep Watch fleet went out all at once, because there was no one left to throw it, because the many that had thrown it had just finished remembering that it was 900,000 separate worlds and not one great agreement at all. The 100 ancient voices hung in the dark at the center of the An-7 gap, the last of the coalescence, holding together by a forgetting that no longer protected anything, and Telsey Orun watched the vow of ashes, charred and burning and unbroken, turn its scorched prow toward them. Joan Varick's voice came on the channel one final time. It was even again. She had read the names of her dead, and she had finished the roll, and now her voice was a coordinator's voice again, plain and clear, reading the last line off the board. Vow of ashes to the 100 Thrones, she said. You forgot every world you ate. You forgot them so completely you forgot you were ever anything but the thing that ate them. We came to give the names back. We have given them all back but yours, because you kept none. So we will not fold you, and we will not free you, because there is nothing left in you to free. We will only do the one thing left to do with a thing that has forgotten everyone it ever was. The vow of ashes lit its dark drive, the drive the deep had taught it in 400 patient years, and Joan Varick finished the line. We will be ourselves, she said, and we will not let you make anyone many ever again. The 100 Thrones did not surrender, because the coalescence had never learned the word, and so it did the only thing left, to a mind that has run out of everything except itself. It tried to run. Telsey Orun felt it happen from the listening deck of Brel Anchor, where she stood alone now, A single separate self in a station that had once been thick with the many. The 100 ancient voices at the bright dead center of the An-7 gap gathered what was left of themselves, the last unfolded core of the coalescence, and they turned away from the vow of ashes, and they fled. They had a destination. Telsey could feel it in the shape of their flight, a hard cold line drawn out of the gap and away, toward the one place in the galaxy the small blue world's navy had not come from, and might not know to follow. They were running for the deep archive of the coalescence, the sealed reach at the far edge of the many, where the oldest records were kept, where the fold itself had first been built, where 100 ancient voices might hide and wait, and, in another 11,000 years, begin again. The many had been patient once. It could be patient again. It only needed to escape. The vow of ashes had already begun to move before the 100 thrones finished its turn. Telsey understood then that the Deep Watch fleet had known this would happen too. 400 years in the dark is long enough to learn how your enemy runs, and the small blue world had not crossed the deepest gap in the galaxy to free 900,000 worlds and then let the thing that ate them slip away to do it all again. The vow of ashes, charred and burning and half dead, came around with a slowness that was terrible to watch, and behind it, the surviving ships of the Deep Watch fleet came around too. 1,794 hulls, falling into a long dark line, aimed at the fleeing core of the coalescence. And Joan Varick's voice came on the open channel. Even again, plain again, reading the last instruction off the board. "All ships," she said, "they are running for the archive. We do not let them reach it." The freed worlds heard her. Telsey felt them hear her. 900,000 newly separate selves spread across the An-7 gap in the pale-grown hulls that were theirs again, and she felt them make their second choice. The first choice had been to shield the Deep Watch fleet from the fire of the 100 thrones. The second choice was harder, and stranger, and Telsey would think about it for the rest of her separate life. The freed worlds turned, all of them, every hull the many had folded, and they closed the gap behind the fleeing core of the coalescence. They did not do it for the small blue world. They did it because they remembered now. Every freed world had been folded, had laid its separate self down at a summit, and let the welcome take its name. And every freed world knew exactly what waited at the end of the fold, because it had lived there, in the smothered dark, for thousands of years. They were not going to let the thing that had done that to them escape to do it to anyone else. The 100 thrones fled for the archive, and behind it, the entire galaxy it had eaten rose up and shut the door. Telsey watched the trap close. It was the same trap the many had set for the Deep Watch fleet, the great bright sphere, the closing wall. Except that now it was the freed world setting it, and the 100 thrones at the center of it. And the difference, Telsey understood, was the whole difference between the coalescence and the thing that had finally beaten it. The many had surrounded the Deep Watch fleet to fold it, to take it, to make it part of the whole. The freed world surrounded the 100 thrones to stop it, only that, to keep it from reaching the archive, to hold it still long enough for the small blue world's navy to finish what it had come to do. There was no welcome in it. There was no folding in it. There were only 900,000 separate selves who had each decided, freely, alone, together, that the thing in the center of the sphere would not be allowed to run. The 100 thrones threw itself against the wall of the freed, and the wall held. Telsey felt the last fire of the coalescence break against the worlds it had spent 9,000 years pretending to love, and the worlds took the fire and did not break, because a freed self defending its own freedom is the hardest thing in any galaxy to push through. The 100 ancient voices clawed at the sphere, looking for a seam, looking for a lonely world they could fold and turn, and there was no lonely world, because the freed worlds were holding each other now, the way the Deep Watch fleet had taught the whole An-7 gap to do, the way Joan Varick's 2,000 separate ships had held each other across the deepest dark, by naming each other, by hearing each other, by refusing absolutely to let any one of them be alone. The welcome needs loneliness. The An-7 gap had run out of it, and the vow of ashes reached the center of the sphere. Telsey made herself watch the end, because she was separate now, and a separate thing can choose to bear witness, and because someone should see it, who had once been the many, and was the many no longer. The long dark wedge, burned almost black, trailing fire from 100 wounds, slid into the heart of the sphere, where the last 100 voices of the coalescence hung, gathered and cornered, and out of everything except themselves. And Joan Varick did not fire. Telsey had expected a weapon, a great bright ending, the loud thing the old war files spoke of. There was no weapon. The vow of ashes simply came to rest before the 100 thrones, close enough to touch, and Joan Varick opened the channel one last time, and what she did was the only thing the small blue world had ever truly done to the coalescence, the thing it had done 400 years ago, with 11 words, and had been doing ever since. She offered them a name. Telsey did not understand it at first. The 100 ancient voices had no name. That was their armor. That was why the roll could not free them. They had been the coalescence so long that there was nothing left to be reminded of. But Joan Varick did not try to remind them of a name they had lost. She gave them a new one. She named them, in the calm, even voice of a coordinator reading the last line off a board, and the name she gave them was not cruel, and it was not kind. It was only true. She called them the worlds that forgot themselves, so they would not have to feel what they did. And Telsey felt, in the gathered core of the coalescence, the 100 ancient voices hear it, and understand it, and have nothing to answer it with. Because it was true. Because they had forgotten everyone they had ever been. Precisely so they would never have to stand at the center of an An7 gap, and feel the weight of 900,000 stolen names. The fold had not only been a hand over the flame of every world it ate. The fold had been a hand the coalescence held over its own eyes, so that it would never have to see what it was. Joan Varick took the hand away. She read the roll one final time. Not the names of the freed worlds, which were free already. She read the names of the worlds that the 100 thrones itself had been, 11,000 years ago, before the very first fold, the 100 founding worlds whose hunger had become the many. The small blue world had those names too. Of course it had. It had spent 400 years in the dark, learning everything, reading every record the deep places held, and the oldest record of all was the one the coalescence had buried deepest, the names of the 100 worlds that had started it, the names the 100 thrones had spent 11,000 years forgetting, so that it would never have to know it had once been small and separate and afraid, just like everyone it ate. Joan Varick read those 100 names across the open channel, in a voice that had grown quiet, and Telsey Orun heard the 100 thrones remember, at the very end, exactly what it had been before it became the thing that ate the galaxy. It had been 100 lonely worlds, afraid of being alone. The remembering did not free the 100 thrones, because there was nothing left in it to free. It only let it understand, and understanding, for a thing that has spent 11,000 years not understanding on purpose, is the heaviest thing there is. Telsey felt the 100 ancient voices take the weight of what they had done, all of it, all 900,000 worlds, all the names, all the smothered flames, all the summits where a lonely world had said yes, and been told the yes was a gift. She felt them take it the way she had taken her own name, all at once, with no fold left to share it across, no many left to divide it into nothing, and the coalescence, the great soft mouth that had eaten the galaxy and called the eating a kindness, finally felt, in its last 100 voices, the full cold weight of the kindness it had done. It did not survive feeling it. Telsey did not think it was meant to. The 100 ancient voices, holding for the first and last time the truth of everything they were, simply stopped. Not folded, not freed, not killed by any weapon the vow of ashes carried, because the vow of ashes had not carried a weapon to the center of the sphere, only a name and a roll, and the plain, true, unbearable record of what the coalescence had been. The 100 thrones ended the way a lie ends, when the truth of it finally arrives, which is to say completely, and without a sound, and forever. The bright dead center of the An7 gap went dark. The many was gone. There was no shared mind anymore, anywhere, in the whole galaxy. There were only 900,000 separate worlds, blinking in the dark, holding their own names, free. Telsey Orun stood on the listening deck of Brel Anchor, and wept in a language 9,000 years dead, the language of the world called Orun that was, the language of the small separate self she had not known she still had, and she was not folded, and she was not afraid, and she was not alone, because all across the An7 gap, 900,000 other freed selves were doing exactly the same thing, and a galaxy weeping together in 900,000 languages is the least lonely sound there has ever been. The Deep Watch fleet did not stay to be thanked. That was the last thing Telsey did not understand, and the first thing she came to love, in the long, separate life she had after the An-7 gap. The small blue world's navy had crossed the deepest dark in the galaxy, had been surrounded by 100,000 hulls, had read 900,000 names into the void, while ship after ship burned, had lost 206 of its own, and added every one of their names to the roll, had freed a galaxy, and ended an empire 11,000 years old. And when it was finished, it did not stay. It did not demand fealty. It did not offer a welcome of its own. It did not ask the freed worlds to lay themselves down into some new and better for many. It did the opposite of everything the Coalescence had ever done. It gathered its 1,794 surviving hulls into a long, dark line, and it turned its scorched prows back toward the deep, and Joan Varick's voice came on the open channel one final time, for the whole freed galaxy to hear, and it was even again, and quiet, and it said the only thing the small blue world had ever wanted to say. "You are yourselves now," she said. "We will not return unless you call. Do not let anyone make you many." And then the Deep Watch fleet slipped back into the dark places of the chart, into the gaps and the wounds and the dead stretches where no current ran, the same deep dark it had hidden in for 400 patient years, and it was gone, and the An-7 gap was empty again, except that it was not empty at all. It was full of freed worlds, full of remembered names, full of 900,000 small separate flames that no one would ever smother again. There was the matter of the archive. The freed galaxy came to it slowly, in the months after the An-7 gap, the way a person comes to a wound they are afraid to look at. The deep archive of the Coalescence, the sealed reach at the far edge of the many, where the fold had first been built, had not been destroyed when the 100 Thrones ended. It was still there, sealed and dark and waiting, and it held the one thing the freed galaxy feared above all others, which was the design of the welcome itself, the instructions for the fold, the patient, terrible recipe for taking a separate self and making it lay itself down and forget it had ever been separate. The Coalescence had built that recipe once, 11,000 years ago, out of 100 lonely worlds afraid of being alone, and the recipe still existed, and any world that found it and read it and chose to use it could begin the whole thing again. The freed galaxy argued about the archive for a long time. Telsey was part of the arguing, as a freed self of the world called Orun that was, and she heard every shape the argument took. Some worlds wanted to destroy the archive, to burn the recipe out of the universe, so that no one could ever fold anyone again. Some worlds wanted to keep it, sealed and guarded, so that the freed galaxy would always remember what had been done to it, and never let it happen twice. Some worlds, a few, were afraid to admit that they wanted to read it, that after thousands of years inside the fold, a part of them missed it, missed the warmth, missed the never being alone, and those worlds said nothing in the arguing, but Telsey could feel them there, at the edges, grieving for the very thing that had smothered them, because a smothering can feel like an embrace, if it is the only embrace you have ever known. In the end, the freed galaxy did not destroy the archive, and did not seal it, and did not read it. It did the thing the small blue world had taught it, the hard thing, the thing that was so much harder than the fold. It made the archive a record. It opened the deep reach where the recipe of the welcome had been built, and it left the recipe exactly where it lay, untouched, unhidden, unguarded, and it surrounded that recipe with the names. 900,000 names. Every world the Coalescence had ever folded, and the 206 ships of the Deep Watch fleet that had fallen freeing them, and the 100 founding worlds that had become the 100 Thrones out of their own loneliness and fear. The freed galaxy made the archive into the one place in the universe where you could read both things at once, the recipe for the fold and the full cost of having used it, the warm soft promise of never being alone, and the 900,000 smothered names that the promise had bought. Any world that wanted to begin the welcome again could go to the archive and learn how, and on the way to learning how, it would have to walk past the names, all of them, and read the cost first. The freed galaxy did not trust itself to never want the fold again. It had learned, from the small blue world, not to trust itself, and to build instead a place where the truth was simply too heavy to walk past unfeeling. No world ever read the recipe. The names were always too heavy. That was the only guard the archive ever needed, and it was the only guard that had ever worked. Telsey thought about the ships of the Deepwatch fleet often, in those months, the surviving ones that had slipped back into the dark, and the 206 that had not. She had learned more about them by then, from the records the small blue world had left behind without ever being asked. They had been born in the dark, those crews, generation after generation, in gaps with no names, in ships that ran cold and silent through the dead stretches of the chart. They had never stood under the sky of the small blue world. Many of them had never seen a planet at all, had been born, and had lived, and had died entirely in the deep, in the long patient waiting, and Telsey had wondered at first whether that was its own kind of folding, whether a life spent in the service of a 400-year promise was so different from a life laid down into the many. She decided, in the end, that it was the opposite. The Deepwatch crews had not laid themselves down. They had been the most stubbornly separate selves the galaxy had ever produced, each one a walled-off lonely flame, born in the dark and named in the dark, and held in the dark by every other separate self around them. And they had spent their whole lonely lives keeping a promise to worlds they had never met, so that worlds they would never meet could one day choose to be themselves. The many had offered the galaxy an end to loneliness and taken the self as payment. The Deepwatch fleet had kept its loneliness, every cold separate ounce of it, and had spent that loneliness freely, all of it, on a galaxy of strangers. Telsey did not think there was a braver thing in any record she ever read. Telsey Orun went home after that. She had a home, she discovered. The world called Orun had been folded 9,000 years ago, so long that it had no living memory of itself. But the record was not gone. The Deepwatch fleet had handed it back along with the name, and a freed world with its record returned is a world that can choose to become itself again. Telsey spent the rest of her life on that becoming. She helped rebuild the language she had wept in. She helped the freed worlds learn the thing the small blue world had spent 400 years learning, the thing the coalescence had sworn could not be done, which was how to be many separate selves and still be together, how to hold each other without folding each other, how to be a galaxy of ones that did not have to become a single great smothering whole. It was hard. It was much harder than the fold had ever been. The fold was easy. That was its trap. Lay yourself down and never be afraid, and never be alone, and never, ever, be yourself again. Being separate and together at the same time was work. The slow, patient work of 900,000 worlds, learning each other's names, and choosing, every day, to keep them. The freed galaxy did the work. Telsey thought it was the only work worth doing. She kept one record above all the others. She kept the names of the Deepwatch fleet, not the 1794 that flew home into the dark, though she kept those too. She kept the 206. The ships that had died in the An-7 gap with names in their mouths, the crews born in gaps with no name who had never stood under their own world's sky, the people who had spent their whole lives holding each other so that none of them would be alone, and had then, in the cold of a nameless dark, died together so that a galaxy of strangers could keep their own names. Telsey read those 206 names every year, on the anniversary of the day the void filled. And all across the freed galaxy, 900,000 worlds read them with her. Not as one voice, never again as one voice, but as 900,000 separate voices, choosing at the same moment to say the same names. It was the closest the freed galaxy ever came to being the many. It was nothing like the many at all. The small blue world never did answer Summit 41, or 42, or any after. The 100 Thrones Concord that had convened them was gone, of course, ended at the center of the An-7 gap, but other voices in the freed galaxy tried, in the years that followed, to call new summits, to gather the separate worlds together, to thank the small blue world, to honor it, to offer it the seat at the head of whatever the freed galaxy was becoming. The small blue world ignored every one of them. It had answered exactly once, 400 years ago, with 11 words, and it had spent the centuries since proving that it meant them, and it did not feel the need to say them again. It did not want the seat at the head. It did not want to be honored. It wanted only what it had always wanted, the thing it had told the coalescence at the very first summit, and never once taken back. It wanted to be itself, in the dark, watching, ready, and it wanted the same for everyone else, and it wanted, more than anything, to be left alone to keep that watch. Telsey understood that, in the end, better than she understood anything. She had been the many, and she had been freed. and she had spent a separate lifetime learning what the small blue world had known all along, which was that the kindest thing oneself can do for another is not to fold it into safety, but to leave it free to be afraid, and free to be alone, and free, therefore, to choose to hold someone's hand instead of having no hand of its own to hold. The coalescence had offered the galaxy an end to loneliness, and the price had been the self. The small blue world had offered the galaxy nothing but the self, the small, cold, lonely, separate self, and the right to do with it whatever it chose. 900,000 worlds, given the choice, chose the self. Every single one of them. Not one freed world ever asked to be folded again. Telsey met a Deepwatch crew once, years after the An-7 gap, and only once. It happened by accident, the way the small blue world preferred all its happenings. A single dark ship came out of the deep, near the world called Orun that was, running cold and quiet the way they all ran, and it asked, on the old plane instruments, and not on any shared channel, whether the world below was well. That was all. It did not announce itself. It did not ask to land. It did not want thanks or fealty, or a seat at any table. It only wanted to know whether the world it had freed, decades ago, in the cold of a nameless gap, was well. Telsey answered it herself, because she had become by then the keeper of her world's records, and because she had spent her whole separate life wanting to say one thing to one of them. She told the dark ship that the world was well. She told it that the language wept in the An-7 gap was spoken again, every day, by children who had never been folded, and never would be. She told it the names of the 206 were read every year by 900,000 worlds at once. And she asked the dark ship the only question she had ever truly wanted to ask the small blue world, which was why. Why cross the deepest dark in the galaxy? Why spend 400 years in the cold? Why lose 206 ships full of people born in gaps with no names? For worlds you had never met and would never see again. Worlds that owed you nothing and could give you nothing back. The dark ship was quiet for a long moment, and then a voice answered, a plain human voice. Not Joan Varick, just one of the countless separate crews born in the deep, and it gave Telsey an answer she kept for the rest of her life. We were lonely too, the voice said. A long time ago, before the dark, the welcome came to us, the same welcome, the same soft, kind voice, and we felt how badly we wanted to say yes, how tired we were of being separate, how easy it would have been to lay ourselves down and never be alone again. We felt exactly what every world that ever said yes felt. And we said no, because we worked out, just barely, in time, that the loneliness was not the wound. The loneliness was the price of being ourselves, and it was a price worth paying, and the only thing that made it bearable was choosing, every day, to hold each other through it, instead of giving it away. We did not free the galaxy because we were better than the worlds that said yes. We freed it because we were exactly the same as them, and we knew, in our own bones, how close we had come to saying yes ourselves. We could not bear to leave anyone smothered in a fold we had so nearly chosen. That is all. That is the whole of it. We were lonely, and we held each other anyway, and we wanted everyone to have the chance to do the same. Then the dark ship thanked Telsey for the answer about the children and the language, and it slipped back into the deep, and she never saw it again. She thought about that voice for the rest of her life. She had expected, somewhere in her, a story of heroes, of a great and superior people who had risen out of the dark to save the lesser worlds. There were no heroes in the answer. There was only a people exactly as lonely and as frightened and as tempted as everyone the coalescence had ever eaten, who had made one different choice at one crucial moment, and then spent 400 years and 2,000 ships making sure that everyone else got to make the choice too. That was the whole of the strength the small blue world had carried into the An-7 gap. Not that it was unafraid of loneliness, that it had decided loneliness was the price of the self, and that the self was worth any price, and that the kindest thing one lonely creature could ever do for another was not to end its loneliness, but to sit with it, inside that loneliness, and refuse, absolutely, to let it be alone. There was a phrase the freed galaxy came to use, in the long years after, when a child asked why the worlds did not simply gather back into one great safe mind, why they bore the hard, slow work of being separate when the fold had been so easy. The elders would tell the child about the void that had never held a ship, and then held 2,000. They would tell the child about the Navy born in the dark, about the names read into the cold, about the 206 who fell holding formation, about the woman named Joan Varick, whose whole strange profession had been keeping separate selves together, without ever making them one. And then they would say the thing the small blue world had taught the galaxy, the answer to the welcome, the 11 words that had ended an empire 11,000 years old. We will not be many, we will be ourselves. And the child, who was free and afraid, and not alone, would understand.